Thank you, John. It's a great honor to be back at Boston College. I'm so proud of this institution. And I was thinking as I was writing my paper and going over it yesterday, going through my files, that in my computer I have a file that's called Nuts, which is responses to people who I think are nuts that send me these letters. And one is to a man who wrote to me and said that Loyola, there was nothing Catholic about Loyola after 1970. And I wrote to him and I said, a part of the thing I said, and the longer I'm in the job, the less I'm inclined to answer these people, but in the beginning I had hopes of conversion, and it doesn't work. But I said, you know, I'm personally insulted by this because you're talking about my generation at Boston College, a similarly situated Jesuit university about which some disgruntled alumni can make similar sorts of claims. And I said, you completely undermine and demean my experience of coming to Boston College as a good Catholic boy and finding an adult faith and a vocation that has been very consoling to me for over 30 years. And you do so in the worst possible way with no knowledge. I said, you know, so in a sense, you really are a disgrace to the Loyola Jesuit tradition that you claim to want to lift up. And it's with that sense of pride that I return to you today, and I'm very, very honored to be asked to speak in this topic, and I'm very grateful to see this great turnout. You may well fall asleep, John and others, but I'd want to point out that one of my former students has returned, and so a glutton for punishment perhaps, but Michael Mahoney from the class of 2000 at the College of the Holy Cross. I'm glad that someone from Mount St. James is represented. And another good friend, Sister Kathleen Dorney, who is the chaplain at St. Joseph's College in West Hartford. She was on the campus ministry and the Morehouse staff, the Catholic campus ministry outreach at Yale when I was a graduate student there. So it's delightful to see so many friends and Boston College friends as well. If you'll permit me, I would like to dedicate my remarks this morning in all humility, to my friend Kim McElhaney. Kim was the director of the Office of College Chaplains at the College of the Holy Cross. I first knew Kim in 1981 when I started teaching at Fairfield as a regent. She was a young campus minister at Fairfield University at that time, and eventually our paths crossed again. Actually, she was one of the lectors at my ordination in 1986, and our paths crossed again professionally for the 12 years that I was at Holy Cross, and an extraordinary person, an extraordinary campus minister who just did so much in her 30 years in campus ministry around the questions that bring us together this morning to reflect on how we sustain and challenge young people to develop a mature and lively faith life. And before I get into one final note, before I get into my formal remarks, my interest comes really from my own reflection, obviously as president, from my own background as a theologian, but also very pragmatically from the fact that we're in the process of reaccreditation, that wonderful exercise that we all look forward to every 10 years. And one of the things that's come up, and the director or the person who's shepherding the progress came to me and showed me the conclusion on our chapter on mission and the recommendations that were in that. And she was really nervous about this, what I would think about it, and should we put this out there. And what she talked about was a sort of silo effect in terms of questions around mission, and that we have a Center for Community Service and Justice. We have 9 professional staff members who coordinate that, distinct from campus ministry. And so the justice piece is sort of handled there. And then the spirituality and worship piece is in campus ministry, very effective. And then the Catholic intellectual life, such as it is in the faculty. And there seems to be a lack of integration around these questions, and so much so that that's what we call our mission person at Loyola. He's the assistant to the president for mission integration, to try to bring these things together. So my talk this morning doesn't have a lot to say about student life or campus ministry. Those areas are not areas in which I have a direct personal experience, and I'm trying to think in some sense as a faculty member, but hopefully to talk about a holistic approach to our students, and I'm very interested in questions of student life. I'm very interested in the students who are before us today and the distinct challenges they present, both in terms of intellectual development and gaining intellectual maturity, but also the real questions of spiritual development. At Loyola, as at Boston College, we do a lot of studying of our students, and the most recent studies around faith and spirituality and commitment indicate that close to 90% of our undergraduates have some sense of a belief in God. Maybe 73% feel very strongly, then in various degrees of questioning and doubt. And I think that's really extraordinary for an undergraduate group at this point in the United States, in our culture. But 70% of the students report that they feel distant from God, which to me is extraordinary. And as a good Ranierian, or I hope at least a reasonable Ranierian, that when you make a claim like that you're also saying something about, when you say something about God, you're saying something about the human condition, about your own condition. And that, to me, that reflects a deep alienation. And that we see the ways in which our students try to address that emptiness and alienation by consumerism, by promiscuity, but with alcohol, with so many other sorts of things. And so it seems to me that there's a real challenge to us as educators to how we are going to help our students find some type of spiritual sustenance that will make that difference and be an antidote to the sorts of things that our culture tells them, our society tells them, our media tells them will fill them up. So, with that in the background, I launch into this, and then I look forward to some discussion and hearing from you in terms of your experiences and the different areas in which you work. Writing in the wake of the Second Vatican Council in an essay entitled "The Spirituality of the Church of the Future," the German Jesuit theologian Karl Rahner offers a sobering prediction about the solitary nature of future faith. Though filled with enthusiasm for the forthcoming positive effects of the Council, one whose vision he had personally done so much to formulate, Rahner nevertheless predicted the decline of an institutional church and of a Christian culture as bullocks of faith. He wrote, "The spirituality of the future will have to live much more clearly than hitherto out of a solitary immediate experience of God and His Spirit in the individual. As inconceivable as it might have been to previous generation, Rahner correctly identified a separation of Christian spirituality from organized religion. The Christian believer of the future would be more solitary, more isolated from ecclesial support. This was because, and again I quote, Christian faith today, and consequently spirituality, must be continually freshly realized in the dimension of a secularized world, in the dimension of atheism, in the sphere of technical rationality, declaring from the very outset that all statements which cannot be justified in light of these rationalities are meaningless, or among, in Wittgenstein's words, mysticism, about which we can only be silent if we are to retain our integrity and sobriety," end quote. Rahner's lapidary conclusion: the Christian of the future will be a mystic, or he will not exist at all. I recently found myself pondering Father Rahner's words when I had the happy task of presiding at the wedding of my cousin's son. In fact, as I was driving here today, I realized the last time I was at Boston College was for this wedding, which took place on the Newton campus. He and his groomsmen were all graduates of Boston College. At the reception that followed, I was amazed that almost all of them made time to speak with me and to introduce their girlfriends or fiancés. They all had fond memories of Boston College and wanted to know if I knew various Jesuits. I mean, I'm at the age, I met these guys, they don't know me, I realize another dreary middle-aged priest, you know, who do you want to hang with? But they literally would not let me go. And I had to tell them, my mother gets worried if I get back after 10 o'clock. You have to understand. And there was the sort of thing that they wanted to know, did I know Father Panna? Did I know Father Appleyard? Did I know Father Kennedy? Did I know Father McMillan? Did I know Father McGowan? They're all stories that they had about these folks. And as a New Englander, fortunately, I could say, yes, I do know these people, and I had stories or things to say about them and my experience with them, which is very frustrating being a New Englander living in Maryland, because I only know the Jesuits of the Loyola University community, and people ask me about other folks, I don't know them. So here I knew all the characters they wanted to speak about. But what they wanted to tell me was how much their interaction with the Catholic Jesuit community of Boston College meant to them, and how they didn't really find the same sorts of experience now that they've left Boston College. That they felt that that they really were very complimentary about my homily, and that they felt that it was real and that it spoke to their situation. And it reminded them of the sort of preaching that they enjoyed while they were at Boston College. They also mentioned about the ways in which Boston College introduced them to the importance of service, the importance of giving back. And that was something that they weren't finding directly in the churches that they were involved with after Boston College. Clearly, they were contented, these young men, to find themselves in conversation with the Jesuit and with each other about their time at Boston College. They enjoyed, if only for an evening, a return to their formative years at the university. And perhaps this underscores Ronner's point. These young men were happy to forego the solitary nature of modern spirituality, and if for only an evening, enjoy the fellowship of faith with other graduates. Happy though it was, you and I must admit that this was also a sorely tried fellowship. Could even the visionary Father Ronner have predicted the shaking of the foundations that the clerical abuse scandal has had for contemporary Catholics? Could he have articulated what happens to faith when the very word Father takes on a malignant hue, one that the early church could never have anticipated when it first began to use that term for ministry? In our lifetimes, the communal experience that we call church will never again step free from a culture of suspicion. Modern peoples are predisposed to be leery of authority. Contemporary Catholics can cite with pain why this is so. Sadly, church leaders have helped to scatter their own flocks, sending souls out to forage in isolation and suspicion. What is the future of the church? How should we who are engaged in the intellectual and personal formation of young people respond? What are the features of the future of cura personalis in Jesuit education? And this is my focus for us this morning. Recall that in characterizing the challenges faced by modern faith, Father Ronner cited the work of the Cambridge philosopher of language, Ludwig Wittgenstein. I would like to suggest this morning that Catholic higher education is experiencing a liminal moment, but not one without illuminating precedents. In fact, one can find a very useful parallel in the intellectual pivot between the thought of the early and the later Wittgenstein. The same thinker both perfectly enunciated the Enlightenment, or modernist, view of the world, and then went on to set the stage for postmodern thought. I think we can learn from Wittgenstein's own shaking of the foundations as we reflect on the shaking of our foundations as a Catholic community. This morning, I would like to speak about the contribution that the Jesuit core curricula make to eloquentia perfecta, and how this latter notion itself speaks to the need of education in postmodern, praxis-oriented society. I want to suggest that praxis alone effectively brings education to bear upon the poverty of our world. And finally, I want to suggest that Jesuit education is ultimately about learning to wonder at the world. At the beginning of the 20th century, Wittgenstein set out to write what he rather brazenly thought would be the final opus in philosophy, his Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus. It was intended to be a propedeutic for a philosophy of science, Wittgenstein wanted to chart, so to speak, the meaning of any word so that each item in a world known by science would correspond to a meaningful word employed by scientists. Many positivists have read the work as delineating between the sense of science and the nonsense of humanities, particularly theology. And the Tractatus does conclude with the oft-quoted admonition, "What we cannot speak about, we must pass over in silence." If we don't have the scientific evidence to back it up, we must keep silent about it, in Wittgenstein's view. Many students entering Catholic higher education today, I believe, want to second the early Wittgenstein. They have been raised on a positivist view of science, believing that all significant questions either can be or someday soon will be answered by science. Some even believe, in the words of Richard Dawkins, that, quote, "God is a scientific hypothesis like any other," end quote. That it must be proved scientifically if we had to put faith into it or if we are to give it credence. Reared in a highly materialistic culture, they possess the faith of most modern men and women, which is to say, they believe in the progressive material betterment of each generation, even though the current economic climate has flustered this faith and called into question their confidence in the leaders of capitalism. Even capitalists are more solitary figures these days. Our students have lived their entire lives in an era of cyber communication. They do not recall a life without a cell phone, the internet, or Facebook. Indeed, they have come to see their own selves as data to be marketed. They spend hours formatting their Facebook pages and giving the right twist to their Twitters. For the most part, they are free from the sexual inhibitions of previous generations. For them, sexual activity is primarily a form of self-expression. And of course, it should be that, but as I mentioned, self-expression in an age of modern media has itself become a commodity. The forces of the market see the modern self as something to be sold. Consequently, sex itself has become something of a commodity. Most don't argue that sex should be sold, yet marketing one's sex appeal is of paramount importance for our contemporaries, young and old. And again, we see this in Facebook, which is probably one of the more benign sites that our students are in touch with, but then many other, Juicy Campus, and there's just a constant stream of them that are impossible to keep up with. Once you get on top of one, there's another one, and they're more vulgar than the previous. So, sex in an age of media capitalism is both ubiquitous and shallow. Donna Freitas writes in her well-known work, Sex and the Soul, Catholic schools seem more adept at creating lapsed Catholics than anything else. Many of the young persons, here I'm quoting, many of the young persons I interviewed were apathetic about their faith tradition, and some literally laughed out loud at Catholic teachings on sex. And, you know, I had this experience. One of our professors in sociology teaches a course on the sociology of sexuality, and questions about Catholic teaching came up, and she asked me if I would speak. And, you know, that a young woman, you know, I would refer to her, again, not dismissively, but, you know, just a kind of a young Colleen, one of our other students that we see so often, attractive, young, Irish-American, furious at the church, and furious at the church about the hypocrisy around same-sex relations. I would not have anticipated that. I would have thought something perhaps about from the feminist perspective, but she knows persons who feel that they have same-sex orientation, and they feel discriminated and pushed out of the church. And at the same time, she's very much sensitive to the abuse crisis and the level of hypocrisy that seems to affect her. And it's very interesting to try to talk to her and to think about that the church is more than a hierarchy, and that was something that was very difficult for her to do. But what really struck me was the real anger that was there. That again, a sort of student that used to encounter being pleasant and nice and happy, but there was this real feeling about the church. She writes, I also learned that the hookup culture doesn't discriminate based on an institution's reputation, rank, wealth, or religious affiliation, at least if the affiliation is Catholic, close quote. And, you know, I just came back from Mexico for the meeting of the international meeting of the presidents of Jesuit institutions and faculty, and Frank Brennan, who I think is no stranger to Boston College, an Australian Jesuit professor of law, he quoted Greg Windsor, who's a former Jesuit and a prominent writer in Australia, and he talked about the Jesuits, men and women for and with others, and care for the whole, well, men and women for others, and how we have this very pervasive kind of motto. And he said, you know, but how far down does it go? And what is the thing that ultimately affects students? Their socioeconomic background and aspirations, or their Jesuit education? Which really will help them appropriate this men and women for others? And I think that's a very real question that we face, particularly at institutions like Boston College and Loyola University, Maryland, where we educate a very large number of affluent young people. And it is what's determinative for them in the way that they make their choices, their socioeconomic background, or the type of education they receive. And I think that that's an open question for us and a troubling one. Freitas admits that her research is limited, but her observations are nonetheless chilling. And they are limited, but I think that they're fairly apt, and again, from my anecdotal perspective. What students call hooking up has never been easier, but sexual liberty has not banished the profound loneliness of modern life. It is easy to see why an educator in the Jesuit tradition might be tempted to echo the early Wittgenstein. What we cannot speak about, we must pass over in silence. How can Christian higher education effectively challenge the positivism of our age, its materialism, its focus upon the isolated individual, its tendency to turn the human person into a commodity? How can we speak to our young people today of sexual maturity and fulfillment? But if Catholic education cannot fall silent, we must carefully discern its distinctive voice. Why were these groomsmen so fervent to return to the fellowship of their college years here at Boston College? Why were they so eager to converse again with a Jesuit educator? At best, are we sending Rahner's lonely mystics out into the world? Is that why these young men were so happy to return when given the chance? Or did the formation they received in Catholic higher education here at Boston College forge a real bond between them? Did it somehow bind them to each other and to previous generations of the faith? As I said, Wittgenstein's own intellectual journey may teach us something about the vocation of the Christian educator. In so many ways, the Tractatus perfectly represents the spirit of the modern age. In its pages, a Cartesian intellect sets out to subdue the world by mastering language. The intellect of the Tractatus is solitary, alone in the world. Language, erudition itself, is a tool for subjugation. Heidegger's warning against a technical approach to life has not yet been heard. No, the individual must learn words in order to exploit the world and its resources. For many of our contemporaries, students and teachers, think that this is the raison d'etre of education. Teach what must be known for the mastery of the world. How does one calculate and denominate in order to dominate? So how does one calculate and denominate in order to dominate? And yet, the closing pages of the Tractatus turn mystical. Wittgenstein wrote, "The facts all contribute only to the setting of the problem, not to its solution. It is not how things are in the world that is mystical, but that it exists." Close quote. In other words, speaking about the world isn't enough. Language also needs to express wonder for the world. And of course, what is true in the Tractatus is equally true of university education. Scientists aren't the only ones searching for the right words, the scientific symbols. So too are poets and saints. Wittgenstein would go on to produce a second opus, one radically different from his first, the Philosophical Investigations. In its pages, language is not a tool for domination. It is the very tissue of a formed life. Language is birthed in communal life and makes this life itself possible. Wittgenstein rejects the notion of a lonely ego setting out to master language. Now the image of that is of that of a child receiving entrance into a community of life. To learn a language is to learn a way of life. Speech itself is an act of communion. As the French phenomenologist Georges Gusdorf put it, language is the necessary and sufficient condition for entrance into the human world. For their very conceptual complexity, Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations offer a deeply human picture of human learning. It is accomplished only in community. It is rooted in praxis, in ways of life. Indeed, to share language is to share life itself. It is to learn from others the cares and the concerns of life, its joys and its hopes, and its sorrows. Isn't that the purpose of our various Jesuit core curricula? Isn't that the purpose of the pursuit of knowledge in a Catholic higher education setting? To allow this, and therefore to allow our students to join a conversation that both predates them and us, faculty, administrators, staff, and the like. To present the human adventure as an inherently communal concern. Eloquentia perfecta isn't simply a matter of learning to speak well. Its ultimate purpose, its spiritual significance, if you will, is to question the purposeful of language itself. Neither eloquence nor education can be said to have achieved their purpose if they don't help us to emerge from alienation. And of course, the linear rationality that was once thought to be the epitome of human knowledge is no longer operative even in the empirical sciences themselves. Recall that Thomas Kuhn's The Structures of Scientific Revolution argued convincingly that progress in science often occurs not only through the trajectory of martial theories, but also through the revolutionary overturning of perceived paradigms. Likewise, the philosopher of science Michael Polanyi in Knowing and Being argued that all human knowledge is acquired tacitly, through praxis, rather than self-conscious objectivity. We don't learn to recognize the face of a companion, ride a bike, or speak with conviction through a series of charts. Our perception of the world is not a straightforward absorption of data. What we want of our world and of our previous experiences of the world determine what we discover within the world. This is what the Canadian Jesuit Bernard Lonergan meant when he insisted that knowing is more than taking a look at the world. And Karen Armstrong concluded her masterful 2009 book, The Case for God, by noting that, quote, religion is a practical discipline, and its insights are not derived from abstract speculation, but from spiritual exercises and a dedicated lifestyle. Without such practice, it is impossible to understand the truth of its doctrines, end quote. The common thread in all these disparate thinkers is the notion that knowledge emerges from a shared form of life, through discourses made possible by language and training. Often critics of Jesuit education, like my friend from my early days at Loyola, chide us for the disparate voices heard on our campuses. Too many feminists, too many gay rights activists, too many who are pro-choice. They ask, shouldn't the church, and so the Catholic University, speak with a single voice? Of course, no one wants to encourage the spread of confusion or errors in matters of faith and morals. But I think the understanding of language that emerges in postmodern thought helps us to answer this very serious question. Wittgenstein argued that language and thought are virtually coextensive. We don't first think a thought and then find words to express it. We never think apart from language. Even when we're searching for the right word and for the right form of expression, we're still using our communal linguistic inheritance in the search. What does this mean for the nature of postmodern education? It means that we have to allow minds to speak because it is speech that stimulates the spirit. Enunciation is essential to the process of thought. Thus, eloquentia perfecta is both the desired end and the exercise required to attain that end. Just as eloquence can't be achieved without exertion, its perfection, which is the articulation of wisdom itself, cannot be achieved without allowing truth to emerge from dialogue. This is a postmodern lesson the church has yet to fully learn. The current clerical abuse crisis is more rooted in silence than sexuality. Human beings have always struggled to live authentic sexual lives. Sometimes that struggle succumbs to sinful and even criminal activity. Men and women of goodwill understand that clergy and religious can also be guilty of grave misdeeds. But the current crisis comes from an imposed climate of silence in the church. Silence about misconduct, as well as about the nature of human sexuality itself. As though the struggle of sexuality would simply disappear if it were denied expression in open discussion. Karl Rahner called the human person spirit in the world. He meant that we are men and women of flesh and bone, sinew and sex. A spirit made incarnate by God cannot forego the struggle to express itself, him or herself, in sexuality of significance and integrity. Silence does not further this struggle. St. Ignatius insisted that darkness and silence are not the realms of the good spirit. Rather, the good spirit seeks expression, enunciation. It seeks out the light. And in a Christian tradition stretching from Augustine through Aquinas to Rahner, that light has always been understood as the cognitive power of the human intellect, one which both reflects and seeks the divine mind. If we understand Wittgenstein, we understand that human cognition requires conversation. The formation of our young people must build upon our deepest Christian understanding of humanity and sexuality, and while the subject may seem full of discord, there is much that all Christians agree on. We all understand that human sexuality is significant. Its very nature is that of an incarnate symbol. It exists as an expression of an embodied spirit, one who must go out of the self towards the other in order to find completion. Human sexuality, like all human activity, is inherently dialogical, and that is why formation and sexuality must be as well. We cannot pass over our human sexuality in silence. And the deepest truth of our Christian faith is that love is dialogical. God, who is Trinity, is nothing less than a dialogue of love. The great architect of the modern Catholic University, Cardinal Newman, chose as his episcopal motto the phrase, cor ad cor loquitur, heart speaks to heart. But how can one heart speak a word of truth to another if only one heart is allowed to speak? Dialogical love can be difficult. It requires to trust in the basic goodness of the other, and even greater trust that God's own truth will be heard in the dialogue. A beautiful example comes to mind. Throughout his short life in the Society of Jesus, Jared Manley Hopkins maintained a lively correspondence with his Oxford classmate, the physician-turned-poet Robert Bridges. As Boston College's own Paul Mariani notes in his really wonderful biography of Hopkins, the Jesuit Hopkins always nursed hopes that his dear friend's agnosticism would give way to Catholic faith. He wrote to Bridges in 1879, "You understand, of course, that I desire to see you a Catholic, or if not that, a Christian, or if not that, at least a believer in the true God." End quote. Of course, Hopkins realized the incongruity of asking an agnostic to pray for his own conversion. So instead, he asked Bridges to give alms, as he put it, up to the point of sensible inconvenience. He explained himself to his friend, writing, "The difference of mind and being between the man who finds comfort all around him unbroken, unless by constraints which are none of his own seeking, and the man who is pinched by his own charity, is too great for forecasting. It must be felt. And indeed, it changes the whole man, if anything can, not his mind only, but the will and everything." In other words, when words alone could not prevail, when it was too much even to ask that words be sent heavenward, Hopkins suggested that the practice of charity might find another way to bind their two hearts together. In this turning to praxis, he is a true son of St. Ignatius. And again, in Hopkins' Victorian worldview, this giving of charity would not be entirely attractive to people today, but we can see the roots of a commitment to justice and of Father Kolvenbach's claim that we don't educate our students completely unless they have an encounter with reality in all its grittiness. And we educate them for a positive solidarity with the poor and the marginalized, but also in the hopes that encountering their dependence, their vulnerability, that we similarly encounter a wellspring to increase our life of faith. Remember that Ignatius did not leave us a treatise on the discernment of spirits. Rather, he wrote a set of exercises correctly perceiving that praxis grounds the human intellect in a shared form of life. All universities study the societal forces that breed poverty. The graduate of a Jesuit institution will hopefully have engaged poverty by meeting the poor themselves, by sharing, however briefly, their lives. Viewing poverty as merely a societal force to be studied and combated runs the risk of viewing the poor themselves as the enemy. This is why poverty can simply not be combated. It must also be shared. In his 2003 letter to the whole society on poverty, Father General Peter Hans Kolvenbach urged Jesuits to root our approach to poverty in the Lord's own gift of self. He wrote, "Following the Lord as a companion in his poverty requires a conversion of heart, sought incessantly by the means of statutes, without doubt, that there are to be observed seriously and generously, but above all, with a familiarity with a Lord who is poor. Indeed, the Lord does not even belong to himself, God from God, light from light, because his very being belongs to his Father and to us, to whom he was sent on a mission of love. Poverty lived in following the Lord cannot be limited to what one has or to be content with regulations on the economic or financial order. It implies a gift of oneself as the very being of the Lord himself, which includes being chaste and being obedient. This is why St. Ignatius called for the highest spiritual poverty, a gift to be asked for in a colloquy, heart to heart, with the Lord poor, because it does ultimately involve conversion of heart. So, Jesuit education is not a marshalling of facts about the world. Remember those words of Wittgenstein. The facts all contribute to setting the problem, not to its solution. It is not how things are in the world that is mystical, but that it exists. Jesuit education Jesuit education is ultimately about seeing the world itself as wonderful and as worthy of our wonder. Karl Rahner is rightly remembered for his insistence that every human being is essentially mystical or spiritual. What he called transcendental revelation was the recognition that we are drawn experientially to a God of mystery, revelation, and love, the three terms by which he often designated the three persons of the Trinity. God always exceeds what we can know, and yet God has spoken the one word that matters, Jesus, and in doing so has revealed love itself as the ultimate fulfillment of human reality. For Rahner, the world itself was Christic, and therefore to serve the world was to serve its Redeemer. He wrote that To the innermost reality of the world, there belongs what we call Jesus Christ in his life and death. Christ actually became, even in his humanity, what he had always been by his dignity, the heart of the universe, the innermost center of all created reality. And thus to love the world, to study the world, to serve the world, is always an encounter with Christ. Can one have a more complete mandate for Catholic higher education? Above all else, it seems to me that we must create a Catholic university that is characterized by Catholicity. And I use the word as it is defined by John Hoy in his book, Where Knowing is Going. For Hoy, Catholicity is not a static concept. It is rather a dynamic, robust questioning orientation in which we, unlike the early Wittgenstein, put nothing out of bounds. We let all the questions lead us where they will. We cling tight to the understanding that our attempt to know the wholeness of life brings us knowledge of the holiness of life. We must create an environment that promotes reflection. We cannot circumscribe discussion, not impose boundaries. We must have faith that the unfettered, reflected, freewheeling, inquiring mind will come in time to see its limitless truths. And again, I think like with what Hoy is suggesting, and to me it seems that there are two types of impositions on academic freedom. And one would be at a Catholic university to impose doctrine into realms where it doesn't belong, to ask scientists to teach Catholic theology or Catholic theology of science in their classes. There's another more subtle type of, I think, limitation of academic freedom is when faculty don't allow the questions to go where they go naturally, so that at some point, because if you keep asking the questions, if you keep pushing the data, you are eventually going to come into the realm of mystery and understand how the ways in which we take so many things on a certain type of faith. And then, to me, and from a Rahnerian point of view, and for Hoy, that's that realm of mysticism, of spirituality, where you can encounter the gracious God who has brought about this world that we seek to encounter. So again, I think that this allowing the questions to go where they go, allowing the students to probe ever more deeply is really consistent with a Catholic university, because for a Catholic university, we cannot be afraid of where the questions take us. We have to be, our faith has to suggest, our intellectual tradition, that what we encounter in our studies is not going to be inconsistent with what we know of the God of Jesus Christ. We cannot foster faith by limiting the scope of reason or by erecting off-limit signs within the realm of intellect. Instead, we must affirm and reaffirm the power and importance of human intelligence. St. Augustine did it in just 3 words: intellectum valde alma, love your mind mightily. The mind mightily loved is mightily opened. This openness can lead to a perception of what Rahner refers to as the Christic ambiance of the world, which ensures, therefore, that every human action done in depth contains at least an implicit mystical experience of Christ. Indeed, as Rahner saw it, God did not create the world and then, after the fall, decide to send his Son. The world was created in view of the Son, to be ready to receive the Son. He even defined the human person in view of Christ as that which happens when God decides to enter creation. In one of his homilies collected under the title of The Great Church Year, translated by Boston College's own Harvey Egan, Rahner wrote, "Wherever the person makes something richer and more meaningful of his life, wherever he creates works of intellect, of science, of art, of literature, however he stamps the imprint of his own spirit on things of earth and expands his own being, there we find culture, and the human being is called to this by God, by virtue of the fact that he is a Christian. This earthly culture is not, of course, itself the kingdom of God, but it is somehow a sign, a promise, a kind of sacramental sign that God loves this world and that he does not let it sink into the chaos of the diabolical, that he loves it despite its sinfulness, that in the same earthly structure that he gave it, that he guards it and cherishes it and enfolds it in the love of his creative will, and therefore that it is through his will that this particular world should exist, this culture, this spiritual universe of human beings. I don't believe that the Boston College alumni whom I met are examples of Rahner's lonely mystics. We live in a wounded world. The church in the 21st century exists just to probe those wounds. We teach for better and for worse in the voice of a fractured and discredited church. In our lifetime, the world's wounds will not be bound up. The church will not regain an untarnished moral authority, if indeed that was ever to be claimed. But through their Jesuit education, these young people have come to love the world, to see it as Christ himself does. Can we ask more of any education? And this is why, as Jesuit educators, we must continue to speak with a quiet assurance, one born of hope. We must teach our students to speak, and we must do that in part by sincerely listening to them. And we must, both students and teachers, sometimes fall silent so that we can hear a wounded world, so that we can take stock of our sins, but most of all, that we can contemplate the wonder of the world's existence, indeed the mystery of the world's existence. Ironically, Wittgenstein himself didn't think much of higher education. He urged his philosophy students to eschew academia for lives of humble service. One of his favorite books was Tolstoy's The Gospel in Brief, whose theme is the imitation of Christ's service, that it means more than any teaching. Taking this to heart, Wittgenstein himself served as a hospital orderly during the Second World War. Remember the closing maxim of the Tractatus: we cannot speak about what we cannot speak about, we must pass over in silence. We cannot talk our students into faith. We cannot talk our church out of its current crisis. But we can listen and we can work. And we can teach by doing both. Thank you very much.